Chapters 10, 11, 12 of The Mirror of the Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mirror of the Sea by Joseph Conrad. Cobwebs and Gossamer. Chapter 10. From the main truck of the average tall ship, the horizon describes a circle of many miles, in which you can see another ship right down to her waterline. And these very eyes which follow this writing have counted in their time over 100 sail becalmed, as if within a magic ring, not very far from the Azores, ships more or less tall. There were hardly two of them heading exactly the same way, as if each had meditated breaking out of the enchanted circle at a different point of the compass. But the spell of the calm is a strong magic. The following day still saw them scattered within sight of each other and heading different ways. But when, at last, the breeze came with the darkling ripple that ran very blue on a pale sea, they all went in the same direction together. For this was the homeward-bound fleet from the far-off ends of the earth, and a Falmouth fruit schooner, the smallest of them all, was heading the flight. One could have imagined her very fair, if not divinely tall, leaving a scent of lemons and oranges in her wake. The next day there were very few ships in sight from our mastheads, 7 at most, perhaps, with a few more distant specks, hull down beyond the magic ring of the horizon. The spell of the fair wind has a subtle power to scatter a white-winged company of ships looking all the same way, each with its white fillet of tumbling foam under the bow. It is the calm that brings ships mysteriously together. It is your wind that is the great separator. The taller the ship, the farther she can be seen, and her white tallness breathed upon by the wind first proclaims her size. The tall masts holding aloft the white canvas, spread out like a snare for catching the invisible power of the air, emerge gradually from the water, sail after sail, yard after yard, growing big, till under the towering structure of her machinery you perceive the insignificant, tiny speck of her hull. The tall masts are the pillars supporting the balanced planes that, motionless and silent, catch from the air the ship's motive power as if it were a gift from heaven vouchsafed to the audacity of man. And it is the ship's tall spars, stripped and shorn of their white glory, that incline themselves before the anger of the clouded heaven. When they yield to a squall in a gaunt and naked submission, their tallness is brought best home even to the mind of a seaman. The man who has looked upon his ship going over too far is made aware of the preposterous tallness of a ship's spars. It seems impossible but that those gilt trucks which one had to tilt one's head back to see, now falling into the lower plane of vision, must perforce hit the very edge of the horizon. Such an experience gives you a better impression of the loftiness of your spars than any amount of running aloft could do. And yet in my time the royal yards of an average profitable ship were a good way up above her decks. No doubt a fair amount of climbing up iron ladders can be achieved by an active man in a ship's engine-room, but I remember moments when even to my supple limbs and pride of nimbleness the sailing ship's machinery seemed to reach up to the very stars. For machinery it is, doing its work in perfect silence and with a motionless grace that seems to hide a capricious and not always governable power, taking nothing away from the material stores of the earth. Not for it the unerring precision of steel moved by white steam and living by red fire and fed with black coal. The other seems to draw its strength from the very soul of the world, its formidable ally, held to obedience by the frailest bonds, like a fierce ghost captured in a snare of something even finer than spun silk. For what is the array of the strongest ropes, the tallest spars, and the stoutest canvas against the mighty breath of the infinite but thistle-stalks, cobwebs, and gossamer? Chapter 11. Indeed, it is less than nothing, and I have seen, when the great soul of the world turned over with a heavy sigh, a perfectly new, extra stout foresail vanish like a bit of some airy stuff much lighter than gossamer. Then was the time for the tall spars to stand fast in the great uproar. The machinery must do its work, even if the soul of the world has gone mad. The modern steamship advances upon a still and overshadowed sea with a pulsating tremor of her frame, an occasional clang in her depths, as if she had an iron heart in her iron body, with a thudding rhythm in her progress, and the regular beat of her propeller heard afar in the night with an august and plodding sound as of the march of an inevitable future. But in a gale the silent machinery of a sailing ship would catch not only the power but the wild and exulting voice of the world's soul. Whether she ran with her tall spars swinging or breasted it with her tall spars lying over, there was always that wild song, deep like a chant, for a bass to the shrill pipe of the wind played on the sea-tops, with a punctuating crash now and then of a breaking wave. At times the weird effects of that invisible orchestra would get upon a man's nerves till he wished himself dead. And this recollection of a personal wish, experienced upon several oceans where the soul of the world has plenty of room to turn over with a mighty sigh, brings me to the remark that in order to take a proper care of a ship's spars, it is just as well for a seaman to have nothing the matter with his ears. Such is the intimacy with which a seaman had to live with his ship of yesterday, that his senses were like her senses, that the stress upon his body made him judge of the strain upon the ship's masts. I had been some time at sea before I became aware of the fact that hearing plays a perceptible part in gauging the force of the wind. It was at night. The ship was one of those iron wool clippers that the Clyde had floated out in swarms upon the world during the 7th decade of the last century. It was a fine period in shipbuilding, and also, I might say, a period of overmasting. The spars rigged up on the narrow hulls were indeed tall then, and the ship of which I think, with our coloured glass skylight ends bearing the motto, "Let Glasgow Flourish," was certainly one of the most heavily sparred specimens. She was built for hard driving, and unquestionably she got all the driving she could stand. Our captain was a man famous for the quick passages he had been used to make in the old Tweed, a ship famous the world over for her speed. The Tweed had been a wooden vessel, and he brought the tradition of quick passages with him into the iron clipper. I was the junior in her, a third mate, keeping watch with the chief officer, and it was just during one of the night watches, in a strong freshening breeze, that I overheard two men in a sheltered nook at the main deck exchanging these informing remarks. Said one, "Should think 'twas time some of them light sails were coming off her." And the other, an older man, uttered grumpily, "No fear, not while the chief mate's on deck. He's that deaf he can't tell how much wind there is." And indeed, poor P., quite young and a smart seaman, was very hard of hearing. At the same time, he had the name of being the very